Before this story begins, before we return to a night far back in time, you do not need to imagine anything clearly or try to follow every detail, because this moment is simply here to help you slow down, to step away from the day that has just passed with all its sounds, thoughts, and unfinished concerns, and to allow your mind to settle into a quiet readiness, like when the lights in the room are dimmed, when the space around you grows calmer, and your body naturally understands that it no longer needs to stay alert, because the story you are about to hear is not meant to rush you, not meant to excite or overwhelm you, but to gently lead you into a very special night. A night where people were not protected by strength or understanding, but by quiet obedience and unseen trust. And as you listen now, you may let your breathing slow just a little without effort, letting it find its own rhythm, because the story itself will move at that same gentle pace, steady and unhurried. And if at any point your thoughts begin to drift, if the edges of the story soften, if you feel sleep beginning to blur what you hear, that is exactly the right state to enter this night, because this is a story that unfolds in darkness and silence, inside closed homes, where no one could see what was happening outside, and yet believed that an unseen hand was passing by. And before stepping into that night, there is only one simple thing to remember: that in this story, safety does not come from understanding everything, but from remaining still in the place prepared for you. And once you are ready to be still, there is nothing more you need to do, and the story can begin. The night began like many nights before it, quiet on the surface and familiar in its darkness, with the sky stretching wide above the land of Egypt, and the air settling into stillness as if the world itself was holding its breath. Yet beneath that calm, something unseen was approaching, something that could not be stopped once it had been set in motion. And while the land outside appeared unchanged, inside the homes of the Israelites there was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of waiting, the kind that fills a space when people sense that a moment is near, even though they do not know exactly when it will arrive. Oil lamps burned low inside those homes, their small flames trembling gently against the walls and casting slow, shifting shadows that made time feel heavier and slower. And families stayed close together, parents drawing their children nearer, voices softened not by fear but by reverence for the instruction they had received, because everyone understood that this was not an ordinary night, even if no one could fully explain why. And earlier that day, each household had done exactly what they were told, choosing a lamb without blemish, preparing it carefully, and marking the doorposts with its blood, not as a sign meant for other people to see, but as a quiet act of obedience placed where only God would look. As the darkness deepened, the doors remained closed, not as barriers of panic, but as boundaries of safety. And inside those walls, people sat, ate, waited, and listened to the soft sounds of breathing and fire, while outside the streets of Egypt lay unaware and unchanged, wrapped in the same night but without the same covering. And the difference between inside and outside was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle and almost invisible. Yet it carried the weight of destiny, because this night was not about movement, but about stillness, not about action, but about remaining, not about fighting, but about trusting that what God had promised would come to pass exactly as he had said. As the hours passed, thoughts slowed and fear softened into quiet expectation, and the people inside those homes began to sense that obedience itself was doing the work for them, that nothing more was required than staying where they had been placed. And some children grew drowsy and leaned against their mothers, while some elders closed their eyes where they sat, will allowing weariness to take over, because waiting does not always feel intense or dramatic. Sometimes it feels like fatigue, and sometimes it feels like surrender. And yet in that surrender, something holy was unfolding beyond what human eyes could see. Without sound and without warning, the angel of the Lord passed through the land of Egypt, moving steadily and deliberately through the darkness. And wherever the mark of obedience was absent, the night did not pass gently. But wherever the sign stood upon the door, the angel did not enter, did not linger, and did not disturb the peace within, but passed over in silence, leaving those inside untouched and unaware in that moment of how close danger had come, until time continued its slow advance, one breath after another and one heartbeat after another, and the sky began to change almost imperceptibly, the darkness thinning at its edges as morning drew near. And though the people inside the homes did not yet know what had happened outside, they could feel that the night was moving toward its end, and that something irreversible had taken place while they remained still. And in that stillness, the foundation of freedom had quietly been laid. The stillness of the night did not last forever, because there comes a moment when silence breaks not with noise but with consequence. And as the angel passed through the land, the unseen became suddenly known. And in one house, then another, and then across the whole of Egypt, grief entered where no preparation had been made. And it did not arrive slowly or gently, but all at once, cutting through the darkness like a wound. Because the firstborn of Egypt fell in the same night, from the house of Pharaoh to the lowest dwelling. And though no trumpet announced it and no messenger ran through the streets, the land itself seemed to awaken to sorrow. At first it was only one cry, sharp and confused, the cry of a mother discovering what could not be undone. And then another voice answered it from a distance, and then another, until the cries began to overlap and spread, rolling through the streets like a wave that could not be contained. And Egypt, which had once slept in confidence and power, now trembled in helplessness, because there was no household untouched, no rank high enough, no strength great enough to prevent what had been spoken by God. And the darkness that had felt ordinary only hours before now felt heavy, crowded with mourning and disbelief. Inside the homes of the Israelites, the night was still quiet, but the quiet had changed, because it was no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of protection. And though they could hear the distant sounds of anguish beyond their doors, fear did not take root inside them, because they had done exactly what was required of them, and without lifting a hand or raising a voice they had been spared, not because they were stronger or more deserving, but because they had trusted the word given to them and remained where they were told to remain. As the cries grew louder and closer, some families held their children tighter, not in panic but in awe, beginning to understand that obedience is sometimes a shelter before it is ever a path forward, and that deliverance does not always come with motion, but often begins with waiting. And though none of them could see the full picture yet, they were standing at the edge of a turning point, a moment when history itself would shift direction, because Egypt could not remain the same after this night, and neither could the people who were about to leave it. Before dawn fully broke, Pharaoh sent word for Moses and Aaron, his authority broken, his resistance finally crushed by a grief too heavy to endure. And the command that had been delayed through plague after plague now came without condition or argument, telling the Israelites to rise and leave, to take what they had and go, because the land that once held them in chains now urged them to depart in haste, fearing that if they remained any longer, Death itself would not stop at the firstborn. And so, while the sky was still dim and the air still cool, movement began among the people who had waited through the night, and doors that had remained closed for safety now opened for freedom, and the blood-marked thresholds that had been signs of protection became the place where a journey began. And though none of them yet knew where the path would lead, they stepped forward carrying something far greater than possessions, carrying the memory of a night when stillness saved them and obedience opened the way. When the command finally came, it did not arrive with celebration or relief, but with urgency, because freedom often begins not with joy, but with haste. And before the sun had fully risen, the Israelites were already moving, gathering what little they had, waking those who had fallen into light sleep during the long night, and in stepping out into the cool air of early morning, with hearts still heavy from waiting and minds struggling to understand how quickly everything had changed, because the land that had held them for generations was now pushing them away, urging them to leave before the day could fully reveal what the night had done. The streets of Egypt were no longer silent, but they were not loud in triumph either. Instead, they were filled with hurried movement and uneasy tension, as Egyptians pressed silver and gold into the hands of the Israelites, not out of generosity, but out of fear, hoping that by giving they might hasten the departure of those whose God had shaken the land. And the people received these things almost without thought, because their minds were already turning forward, fixed on the path ahead rather than the wealth behind. And for the first time they walked not as slaves moving under command, but as a people moving together by promise. Children stumbled sleepily beside their parents, elders leaned on staffs worn smooth by years of labor, and the sound of footsteps rose softly from the ground, steady and countless, as if the earth itself was listening to their passing. And though no walls fell and no chains were dramatically broken in that moment, something far deeper had shifted, because slavery had ended not with violence but with a word fulfilled. And the people who had once risen each day to serve another master now walked under a sky that felt wider than it ever had before. As the light slowly grew, revealing the vast number of those who were leaving, a quiet realization spread among them that they were not simply escaping Egypt. They were stepping into something unknown, and that knowledge brought with it both hope and uncertainty, because freedom is not instantly comfortable, and the open road can feel more frightening than familiar bondage. Yet even in that uncertainty, there was a sense of direction, because they were not wandering aimlessly, they were being led. At the front of the people moved Moses, carrying the weight of a calling that had only grown heavier with fulfillment, and beside him walked Aaron, and above them, unseen but unmistakable in presence, was the guidance of God himself, who did not leave them to guess their way forward, but marked the path with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. A constant reminder that though the future was unclear, they were not alone in it. And so they walked on, leaving behind homes they would never enter again, fields they would never work again, and graves they would never return to, carrying with them memories of pain, moments of fear, and the quiet wonder of having been spared in the night. And as their steps carried them farther from Egypt, the sound of mourning faded behind them, replaced by the rhythm of a journey that had only just begun. A journey born from obedience, sealed in stillness, and now unfolding step by step into a destiny that would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. As the people moved farther from Egypt, the weight of what they had done began to settle into their thoughts, because leaving is easy in the first steps, but understanding that there is no return comes later, And with each mile, the distance behind them grew, the familiar fading quietly into memory, while the unknown ahead stretched wider and more silent. And in that silence, questions began to rise, not spoken aloud at first, but carried in the hearts of those who walked, wondering what kind of land lay beyond the horizon and whether freedom would truly feel like rest. The days unfolded slowly, marked by the steady rhythm of walking and the constant presence of the cloud above them, a sign that never rushed them and never abandoned them. And when the sun burned hot over the desert, it shaded them gently. And when the night grew cold, it became fire, warming the darkness and reminding them that guidance does not always speak. Sometimes it simply stays. And though the people did not yet understand the path they were taking, they learned to follow not by sight alone, but by trust. Yet trust is not built in a single moment. And as the journey continued, fear found its way into quiet conversations and tired glances, especially when word spread that Pharaoh's heart had changed once again, that the grief which had driven him to release the people had turned into anger, and that the sound of chariots was rising behind them like distant thunder. And suddenly the open space ahead no longer felt like freedom, but like exposure, because when fear approaches, even a miracle-filled past can feel fragile. When the people finally saw the dust on the horizon and heard the echo of horses and wheels, panic moved quickly through the camp, and voices that had once whispered in wonder now rose in alarm, questioning why they had been brought out only to be trapped. And in that moment, the memory of slavery seemed safer than the uncertainty of deliverance. Because fear often reshapes memory, making chains feel familiar and freedom feel dangerous. They stood with the sea before them and the army behind them, pressed between what they could not cross and what they could not escape. And the stillness returned, but this time it was heavier, filled not with waiting but with dread. And the people turned to Moses, not in trust but in accusation, because when fear reaches its peak, it looks for someone to blame. And Moses himself stood quietly, carrying the weight of thousands of frightened hearts, knowing that the path forward could not be chosen by human strength. And then, in the space between panic and despair, Moses spoke words that did not promise ease or speed, but called for stillness once more, reminding the people that the same God who had acted in the night was not finished acting in the day. And as the wind began to rise and the sea responded in ways no one had ever seen before, the people were being taught a truth they would learn again and again, that deliverance often places us where we cannot move at all, until God himself makes a way where none appears to exist. The moment did not arrive with thunder or sudden light, but with a steady wind that began to move across the water, at first gently and then with purpose. And as Moses lifted his staff and stood facing the sea, the people watched in silence, unsure whether hope or disappointment would follow, because faith often asks us to stand still at the edge of impossibility before anything changes at all. The wind grew stronger through the night, pushing against the surface of the sea until the waters began to respond, not violently, but deliberately, drawing back as if guided by an unseen hand. And slowly a path emerged where moments before there had been only depth and uncertainty. And the sound of the wind filled the air like a long breath being held, steady and unbroken, while walls of water rose on either side, standing firm without collapsing, creating a passage that no human effort could have formed. At first no one moved, because seeing a miracle does not always remove fear. Sometimes it deepens it, and the people stood at the shore staring into the corridor of water, wondering whether the ground beneath would hold them or betray them. And it was only when Moses stepped forward that movement began, one step followed by another, until the people entered the sea not running but walking, carrying children, supporting the weak, and guiding the elderly across ground that felt strangely solid beneath their feet. As they moved between the walls of water, the world around them felt suspended, quiet except for the wind and the sound of footsteps. And though danger stood on either side, it did not touch them, and fear slowly gave way to awe, because they were not merely escaping an army, they were walking through what had once been an impassable barrier, learning with every step that the path of deliverance is often narrower than expected, but always sufficient. Behind them, the sound of chariots grew louder, and Pharaoh's army followed into the sea with confidence turned to desperation, believing the way open to all. Yet the same path that held firm for the faithful began to resist those who pursue with violence in their hearts. And as confusion spread among the soldiers, the wind shifted, the waters trembled, and the moment of passage drew to its close. When the last of the people reached the far shore and stood together, breathless and still, Moses once again raised his staff, and the sea returned to its place, closing over what had threatened them, not in rage but in completion. And the night that had begun with waiting and continued with walking now ended in freedom fully realized, as the people stood on dry ground, watching the waters settle into calm once more. In that moment, the fear that had followed them from Egypt finally loosened its grip, replaced by a quiet understanding that what had been done for them could never be undone. And as the sun rose over the sea and light touched their faces, the people stood not as slaves who had escaped, but as a people who had been carried through, learning that when the way forward seems impossible, it is often because the moment has not yet arrived for God to open it. For a brief moment after the sea returned to its place, there was sound again among the people, voices rising in relief and wonder, songs breaking forth almost without thought. Because when fear finally releases its grip, the heart often responds before the mind can catch up. And the people sang of what they had seen, of the power that had carried them through, of the enemy that had been swept away. And in that moment, joy felt complete and certain, as if nothing difficult could ever follow such a victory. Yet joy, like sound, does not linger forever. And as the echoes of celebration slowly faded into the open air, the quiet returned, not the dangerous silence of Egypt, nor the tense stillness of the shore, but a wide and unfamiliar silence, stretching out before them as far as they could see. Because once the sea was behind them, there was nothing immediately ahead except wilderness. And the realization settled gently but firmly that freedom does not end at rescue. It begins there. They moved forward again, step by step, leaving the shoreline behind. And the land grew dry and bare beneath their feet, the sun rising higher each day, and the wind carrying less moisture with it. And soon the rhythm of walking replaced the memory of singing, and thirst replaced the warmth of triumph, because the body remembers its needs even when the soul is full. And the people began to feel the weight of the desert pressing in around them. Whispers returned, not of fear this time, but of discomfort. Questions asked quietly at first and then more openly, wondering where water would come from and how long the journey would last. And though they had just witnessed the sea open before them, their memories were still learning how to hold faith alongside need, because miracles do not remove hunger, and trust is often tested not by danger, but by delay. When they reached waters that looked promising but proved bitter, disappointment spread quickly, because hope raised and then broken can feel sharper than hope denied from the beginning. And the people turned again to Moses, their voices heavy with exhaustion rather than anger, asking why they had been led so far only to find what could not sustain them. And Moses listened, carrying their weariness as he had carried their fear. And once more, without spectacle or drama, God provided, not by changing the desert into abundance, but by making what was there usable, teaching them that provision does not always come as excess. Sometimes it comes as enough. And as the waters were made sweet and the people drank, strength returned slowly, quietly, and the lesson began to take root that the God who rescues in power also sustains in patience. As night fell over the camp and the desert cooled, people settled into rest, their bodies tired and their thoughts heavy, and the stars spread wide above them, countless and calm. And in that vast quiet, a new understanding began to form, that this journey would not be carried by constant wonder or uninterrupted joy, but by daily trust, renewed again and again in small ways, until faith itself became a kind of rest. After the people had rested through the cool of the night, the desert greeted them again with its wide silence, and morning came without urgency, spreading light gently across the ground, as if inviting them to rise rather than commanding them to move. And when they stepped outside their tents, they noticed something unfamiliar lying across the earth, small and pale, like frost that had chosen to remain after the sun appeared. And for a long moment no one spoke, because wonder often quiets the voice before it stirs the mind. They asked one another what it was, not in excitement, but in uncertainty, because freedom had taught them that the unfamiliar could carry either promise or disappointment. And Moses explained that this was the provision of God, a given not in abundance for storing, but in sufficiency for the day, teaching them a new rhythm of living, one that required trust renewed each morning rather than security gathered in excess. And as they collected what was needed, each person found that it was enough, no more and no less, as if the measure itself carried a lesson. This daily provision reshaped their understanding slowly, because they had lived too long under systems that demanded constant labor and offered little rest. And now they were being invited into a pattern where sustenance arrived before effort, and where obedience meant restraint as much as action, learning not to take tomorrow into their hands, but to receive today as it was given. And though some struggled with this new way, the desert patiently repeated its lesson with each sunrise. As days turned into weeks, the people began to settle into this quiet dependence, walking when guided, resting when told, and learning that faith is often built not in moments of danger, but in routines of trust, where the same grace appears again and again, without spectacle. And even when weariness returned, it no longer carried the same fear, because they were beginning to understand that they were being sustained, not abandoned. At night, as the camp grew still and the fire glowed softly, stories were told in low voices, memories of Egypt gradually loosening their hold, replaced by new memories formed under open skies. And children fell asleep, listening to the sound of wind moving across the sand, while elders watched the stars and wondered at the patience of a God who was shaping a people not by force, but by presence. And in that gentle repetition of days, walking, resting, gathering, and trusting, something deeper was taking place, because a people once defined by bondage were learning how to live free without becoming lost, discovering that the same God who had passed over them in the night and carried them through the sea was now teaching them how to wake each morning without fear, knowing that provision would come again, quietly, faithfully, just as it always had. As the journey carried on, the desert revealed its true nature, not as an enemy rushing to strike, but as a teacher that works slowly and without urgency, repeating the same lessons day after day until they settled deep into the heart. And the people began to understand that the wilderness was not meant to destroy them, but to strip away what they had carried too long. Habits formed in captivity, fears shaped by years of being commanded rather than guided, and expectations built on control instead of trust. Time moved differently there, because without walls or cities to mark the passing of days, life became measured by simpler things: the rising and setting of the sun, the gathering of daily provision, the movement of the cloud above them. And in that simplicity, the people were forced to face themselves, their impatience, and their longing for certainty, and their quiet struggle to believe that presence could be enough even when answers were delayed. There were moments when memory reached back toward Egypt, not because it was good, but because it was familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than growth. And the people spoke of food they once ate and routines they once knew, forgetting the chains that had accompanied them, because the mind has a way of softening the past when the present feels demanding. And yet each time those thoughts surfaced, the desert gently countered them with the same invitation: to stay, to wait, and to trust what could not yet be seen. Moses watched this process unfold with patience, shaped by his own long years of waiting, understanding that transformation rarely happens quickly, and that a people shaped by centuries of bondage could not become free in a single generation without learning how to live differently from the inside out. And so he guided them not only by instruction, but by example, returning again and again to the presence of God, seeking direction not for control, but for care. At night, when the camp grew quiet and the fire dimmed to embers, the desert sky opened wide above them, filled with stars too numerous to count. And in that vastness, the people felt both small and held, realizing that the same God who had marked their doors in Egypt and led them through the sea was still watching over them in the open wilderness, not bound to temples or borders, but present wherever they rested. And slowly, almost without noticing, fear began to lose its sharpness, replaced by a steady endurance, a quiet strength that did not rely on certainty but on faith practiced daily. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, the people were no longer merely escaping the past. They were being shaped for a future that would require patience, humility, and a trust deep enough to rest even when the desert stretched on in silence. As the days in the wilderness stretched into longer seasons, waiting began to feel heavier than walking, because movement gives the heart a sense of progress, while waiting asks it to remain open without clear reward. And though the clouds still guided them and daily provision still appeared each morning, impatience quietly found its way back into the camp. Not as open rebellion at first, but as restlessness that settled deep into tired minds and weary bodies. The people began to feel the distance between promise and fulfillment, sensing that freedom had brought them into a space where answers were slower and direction required more listening than action. And in that space, uncertainty grew, because the human heart often struggles when it cannot measure progress or predict outcomes. And even faith can feel fragile when silence lasts longer than expected. When Moses went up the mountain to seek guidance, the waiting intensified. because the familiar presence of leadership was replaced by absence. And absence has a way of magnifying fear. And as hours turned into days and days into weeks, the people below grew uneasy, wondering whether they had been forgotten or left to find their own way. And memory once again began to reshape the past, turning captivity into something almost comforting compared to the discomfort of uncertainty. In their unease, the people sought something tangible, something they could see and touch, something that would move when they asked it to move and respond when they called upon it, because waiting on the unseen requires patience. And patience was still a lesson being learned. And so they fashioned an image, not out of malice, but out of longing for immediacy, choosing certainty they could control over faith that required trust. The silence that followed was different from before, not calm and wide, but tense and uneasy, because even when the camp appeared busy and voices were raised in activity, something sacred had been disturbed, and the people felt it without fully understanding it, as if the desert itself had grown quieter in response, in watching to see what would come next. When Moses returned, carrying words meant to shape a people into something lasting, the weight of what had happened became clear, not as a sudden punishment, but as a sorrowful realization that freedom is not only about being let out, but about learning how to remain faithful when guidance feels distant. And the people stood once more at a turning point, understanding that the journey through the wilderness was not merely about reaching a land, but about becoming a people capable of living there. And as the night settled again over the camp, fires burned lower, voices softened, and reflection replaced noise. And in that quiet, the people were reminded that trust, once shaken, must be rebuilt slowly, not through fear, but through humility and patience. And the desert, unchanged and steady, awaited with them, offering once more the long, quiet path of learning to listen before moving forward again. After the moment of failure had passed and the weight of realization settled over the camp, life did not end, nor did the journey stop, because mercy does not erase consequence, but it does reopen the path forward, and the people slowly returned to the rhythm they had been taught, gathering daily provision, following the movement of the cloud, and learning once again how to walk without demanding constant reassurance. The desert did not change its nature in response to their mistakes. It remained wide and patient, offering the same lessons as before. And in that consistency, the people began to understand that God's faithfulness was not fragile, that it did not disappear at the first sign of weakness, but remained steady, in inviting them back into trust even after trust had been broken. And this understanding softened hearts that had grown hard through fear and disappointment. Moses continued to guide them with a quieter authority, shaped now not only by calling, but by compassion, knowing that leadership in freedom required more listening than command. And as he moved among the people, disputes were settled, routines were established, and the community slowly took shape, not as a crowd escaping danger, but as a people learning how to live together under guidance rather than control. Days followed days without dramatic events, and this lack of spectacle itself became a gift, because the people were learning that life with God is not sustained by constant miracles, but by steady presence, and that faith grows strongest not in moments of crisis, but in ordinary time, when obedience feels repetitive and trust must be chosen again without immediate reward. At night, when the camp settled into rest, the sounds of the desert wrapped gently around them, wind moving softly across the sand, distant calls of animals fading into silence, and beneath the open sky, the people found a new kind of rest, not the rest of certainty, but the rest of belonging, knowing that though the journey ahead remained long, they were not wandering aimlessly, but walking within a promise that was unfolding at its own pace. And so the wilderness continued to shape them, day by day and night by night, teaching them that freedom is not a single moment won in the past, but a way of living learned slowly, patiently, and often quietly, until trust itself becomes familiar. And the heart learns how to rest even while the path stretches on. As time passed in the wilderness, something subtle but lasting began to form among the people, not marked by sudden signs or dramatic change, but by the slow shaping of daily life, because routines repeated long enough begin to shape the heart, and the simple acts of walking together, resting together, and listening together slowly transformed a crowd into a community. They learned how to order their days around guidance rather than urgency, rising when it was time to move and settling when it was time to rest. And in that rhythm, the chaos of fear gradually loosened its hold, replaced by a quieter attentiveness. Because when life is no longer driven by survival alone, the soul has space to notice what it had long ignored. The presence that remained constant even when circumstances shifted. Disagreements still arose because freedom does not erase human difference, but they were met now with patience learned through waiting, and conflicts that once might have broken unity were softened by the shared memory of how far they had come together. And the people began to understand that freedom was not meant to be lived alone, but shared, guarded, and practiced within relationship. Children who had once known only labor and fear now played in open spaces, their laughter carrying lightly across the camp, and elders who had bent under years of oppression found moments of rest beneath the shade, watching a new generation grow without the same weight upon their shoulders. And these quiet scenes spoke as loudly as any miracle, revealing that transformation was already taking place, even if the final destination remained distant. Moses continued to return to the presence of God, not seeking spectacle, but wisdom for guiding a people who were no longer slaves, but not yet settled. And the words he brought back shaped their understanding of justice, rest, and care for one another, teaching them that freedom required structure not to control them, but to protect what was being formed among them. At night, when the camp settled into stillness, the sounds of shared life lingered softly, footsteps fading, voices quieting, fires dimming, and under the wide desert sky, the people rested not in certainty, but in belonging, knowing that though the path ahead was still unfolding, they were no longer defined by where they had come from, but by who they were becoming together. And in that slow, unremarkable passing of days, the wilderness continued its work, shaping hearts as much as direction, preparing a people not just to enter a land, but to live within it with humility, patience, and a trust strong enough to endure long after the journey itself was complete. As the people continued onward, the wilderness became less a place they passed through and more a place that stayed with them, shaping their thoughts even when their feet were moving, because time spent waiting leaves marks deeper than distance traveled, and the days began to blend together, marked not by events but by remembrance, as stories of what God had done were repeated again and again, so they would not be lost to forgetfulness. Moses spoke often to the people, not only reminding them of commands, but calling them back to memory because he understood that faith weakens not only through rebellion, but through forgetting, and he urged them to remember the night when they were spared, the path through the sea, and the provision that met them each morning, knowing that remembrance itself was a form of worship, anchoring the heart when the road ahead felt long. The people learned to tell these stories to their children, not with urgency or fear, but with calm assurance, shaping identity through shared memory, so that the next generation would know not only where they were going, but who had carried them this far. And in these retellings, the past was not relived with pain, but held with gratitude, transformed from suffering into testimony. Even so, the wilderness did not stop presenting its challenges. Because remembrance does not remove hardship, it strengthens endurance. And when weariness returned or patience thinned, the people were invited once again to look backward in order to keep moving forward, trusting that the same faithfulness that had guided them before would not abandon them now. As evening came and the camp settled, these stories drifted through the quiet air, spoken softly beside small fires, mingling with the sounds of night. And children fell asleep hearing of a God who listens, who leads, and who remains present even when the path stretches farther than expected. And in that gentle repetition, the people were learning that their journey was not only about reaching a destination, but about carrying truth forward, step by step, generation by generation. And so the road continued, steady and unhurried, shaped as much by memory as by movement, and in the stillness of the desert nights, the people rested with a growing confidence, knowing that even if the journey required time, the promise they were walking toward had already begun to take root within them. As the journey carried on, the people slowly learned that not every step needed to be hurried because the wilderness did not respond to rushing, and the cloud above them moved only when it was time, teaching them that progress was not measured by speed but by alignment, by moving when guided and resting without guilt when the signal to remain was given. This slower pace began to reshape their inner lives, because those who had once been driven by commands now had to listen, and listening requires stillness, and stillness can feel uncomfortable to hearts accustomed to constant motion. Yet within that discomfort, something new was forming, a patience that did not demand immediate results, and a trust that did not collapse when days looked the same as the day before. They became attentive to small changes, the shifting of light at dawn, the way the air cooled in the evening, the movement of the cloud as it lifted or settled. And these small signs carried great meaning, because guidance was no longer rare or dramatic. It was woven into ordinary moments, teaching them that God often leads not through force, but through quiet consistency. Conversations in the camp softened, no longer filled with the same urgency or complaint, but shaped by reflection as people shared what they were learning, not as conclusions, but as questions. And in those shared uncertainties, a deeper unity formed. Because freedom had taught them that they were not expected to know everything at once, only to remain faithful in the space they were given. Children who had grown up in the wilderness adapted easily to this rhythm, their lives shaped not by memory of chains, but by the patterns of guidance and rest. And watching them, the elders understood that the journey was already bearing fruit, even if the land promised ahead remained unseen, because transformation was happening quietly within daily life. As night returned once more, the camp settled into rest, fires glowing low, voices fading, and the desert wrapped itself gently around them. And in that calm, the people rested without urgency, trusting that when morning came, the path forward would be made clear again, just as it had been the day before and the day before that, steady and sufficient. As the people settled deeper into the rhythm of the journey, rest began to take on a new meaning, no longer seen as a pause forced by exhaustion, but as a gift intentionally woven into their days, because they were being taught that life under guidance was not meant to drain them, but to sustain them through balance, movement paired with stillness, effort paired with trust. There were times when the cloud remained in one place longer than expected, holding them in stillness for days, and in those moments impatience once again tested their hearts. Yet over time they learned that rest was not wasted time, and that waiting did not mean being forgotten, but being protected from moving too soon into what they were not yet ready to face. This understanding slowly reshaped their sense of worth. Because in Egypt, value had been measured by productivity, by how much they could produce or endure, and now they were learning that worth was not earned through constant labor, but received through relationship, and that obedience sometimes meant stopping rather than pressing forward. Families use these periods of rest to draw closer, sharing meals without hurry, speaking words that had long gone unspoken, and tending to one another in ways that had not been possible under the weight of slavery. And in these quiet interactions, the people began to heal from wounds that had been carried silently for generations. Moses watched this transformation with quiet gratitude, understanding that the law and guidance he carried were not meant to restrict life, but to protect it, and that rest itself was a form of trust. A declaration that provision did not depend solely on human effort, but on the faithfulness of the one who guided them. When night fell and the camp settled once again, the stillness felt deeper, more settled, and beneath the open sky, the people rested without fear of falling behind, knowing that when it was time to move, the signal would come. And until then, rest was not only allowed, but invited, shaping a people who could move forward without losing their souls along the way. As the journey unfolded further, the people began to notice that guidance did not always arrive through movement, but often through quiet awareness, because the longer they walked under the cloud, the more they understood that listening required more than ears. It required attention, patience, and a willingness to remain present even when nothing seemed to be happening. Silence became less threatening to them over time, no longer filled with fear or uncertainty, but with possibility, because they had learned that some of the most important moments were not announced with sound or spectacle, but revealed gently to those who were willing to wait. And in that waiting, the heart learned to recognize what truly mattered. Moses encouraged this attentiveness, reminding the people that guidance was not only something to follow outwardly, but something to receive inwardly, shaping decisions, relationships, and attitudes. And as the people practiced this kind of listening, their responses softened, their words grew fewer, and their actions more deliberate, because wisdom had begun to replace urgency. In the quiet of the evenings, when the day's heat had faded and the desert cooled, individuals found moments to reflect on their own journeys, not just the shared path of the people, but the personal changes unfolding within them, recognizing fears that had loosened their grip, habits that no longer held power, and a growing trust that did not depend on constant reassurance. Children watching the calm of their parents and elders learned that silence did not need to be filled, that stillness could be safe, and that waiting did not mean absence. And these lessons shaped them deeply, forming a generation that would carry forward a different understanding of faith, one rooted not in fear of punishment, but in confidence of presence. As night wrapped gently around the camp, the people rested with a new kind of peace, not because all questions had been answered, but because they had learned how to listen without anxiety, trusting that when guidance was needed, it would come, and until then, the quiet itself was enough to carry them through. As the days continued in their steady rhythm, the people began to discover a kind of strength that did not announce itself, because it did not come from conquest or speed, but from endurance quietly practiced. And this strength showed itself not in moments of danger, but in ordinary mornings when they rose without complaint, and in ordinary evenings when they rested without fear. They learned that weakness did not disqualify them from the journey, because the path had never depended on their perfection. And this understanding softened the sharp edges of self-judgment, allowing compassion to grow not only toward one another, but within their own hearts. And in that gentleness, resilience took root, steady and reliable. When challenges appeared, whether in the form of fatigue, disagreement, or uncertainty, they were met differently now, not with panic or accusation, but with a pause, a breath, and a return to what had been learned. That guidance would come, that provision would arrive, and that no single moment of struggle defined the whole journey. Moses observed these changes quietly, understanding that leadership was gradually shifting from instruction alone to example, because the people were learning not just what to do, but how to be. And this internal transformation mattered more than distance covered, shaping a community capable of carrying responsibility without losing humility. The wilderness itself seemed to echo this lesson, offering no shortcuts and no distractions, and only the same wide horizon and steady sky, inviting patience and discouraging haste. And within that environment, the people found a rhythm that balanced movement with rest, effort with surrender, and trust with action. As night returned and the camp settled once more, the quiet felt familiar rather than empty, and beneath the stars the people rested with a deeper confidence, knowing that strength did not need to be proven each day, but could be trusted to grow unseen, carried forward by faith practiced gently, faithfully, and without hurry. Over time, the people began to notice a quiet shift within themselves, because where they once tried to control every outcome, they were now learning to release their grip, understanding that trust was not passive surrender, but a steady choice to move forward without forcing the future to reveal itself too soon. This release brought an unexpected lightness, as though burdens they had carried for years were gently set down, and in their place grew a calm acceptance of the present moment, allowing them to engage fully with each day without exhausting themselves by worrying about what lay beyond the horizon. Conversations within the camp changed subtly, becoming less focused on complaints and more centered on reflection, memory, and quiet hope. And even disagreements, when they arose, carried less sharpness, because patience had begun to guide their words, reminding them that unity mattered more than being right. Moses continued to guide them, but now his role felt less like leading from the front and more like walking among them. Observing how trust had reshaped their responses, knowing that this transformation could not be commanded, only cultivated through time, experience, and consistent presence. The desert nights reinforced this lesson, as the vast sky stretched endlessly above them, reminding the people how small they were in comparison, yet how carefully they were held. And this awareness did not diminish them, but freed them from the illusion that everything depended on their strength alone. As sleep came gently upon the camp, hearts rested not because all control had been regained, but because it had been released. And in that release, the people discovered a deeper peace, one that allowed them to fall asleep without fear, confident that the journey continued even while they rested. As the journey carried on, memories began to surface more often among the people, not as wounds that reopened, but as quiet reflections that no longer demanded pain, because time and trust had softened their edges, allowing the past to be remembered without pulling the heart backward. They spoke of earlier days with a gentler tone now, recognizing both the hardship and the care woven through those moments, understanding that even the most difficult seasons had shaped them, preparing their hearts for a freedom that was not merely physical, but deeply internal. This shift allowed gratitude to grow where bitterness once lived, because the people could now see that survival had not been accidental, and that guidance had been present even when it was not understood. And this realization transformed memory from a burden into a teacher. Moses listened as these reflections were shared, aware that remembering well was as important as moving forward, because a people who could hold their story without regret would be able to face the future without fear, grounded in the knowledge that they had already been carried through more than they once believed possible. Even the children absorbed these lessons, learning the stories not as warnings meant to frighten them, but as testimonies meant to steady them, shaping a shared identity rooted in resilience, humility, and trust rather than shame. As night settled again over the camp, the people lay down with minds untroubled by the past, holding their memories like soft lamps rather than heavy chains. And in that gentle remembering, sleep came easily, unhurried and complete. As the people moved forward, they slowly realized that the journey was no longer defined by how far they had traveled, but by how deeply they had changed, because what once felt like endless wandering now felt like a careful shaping, each step refining not only their direction, but their hearts. There was no sudden announcement that everything had become clear, no single moment where all questions were answered, yet a quiet confidence settled among them, the kind that does not need proof, because it is rooted in lived experience, carried gently through days of provision, correction, rest, and renewal. They understood now that guidance had never been about reaching a destination as quickly as possible, but about becoming a people capable of living well wherever they were placed. And this understanding removed the urgency that once drove them, replacing it with a steady presence, grounded and attentive. Moses sensed this shift as well, seeing fewer restless glances toward the horizon and more peaceful engagement with the present moment, knowing that when a people learn to stand firmly where they are finally ready to move forward without fear. Even the wilderness seemed less harsh, not because it had changed, but because the people had learned how to dwell within it, how to receive from it lessons of patience, humility, and trust, discovering that peace does not depend on surroundings, but on alignment within. As night approached once more, the camp rested in a stillness that felt complete, not waiting anxiously for what would come next, but content to be held in the now, breathing evenly under the wide sky, hearts calm, bodies at ease, prepared gently, quietly, for whatever morning would bring. As the final moments of the journey settled into stillness, the people no longer searched for signs with anxious eyes, because they had learned that being held was more important than knowing every step ahead, and that peace did not arrive when the road ended, but when the heart stopped resisting where it was. Nothing dramatic marked this ending, no loud declaration, no sudden change in the sky, only a deep, steady calm that wrapped itself around the camp, as though everything that needed to be said had already been spoken through time, through patience, through trust practiced again and again. They understood now that they were never walking alone, not in fear, not in silence, not even in uncertainty, and this awareness allowed their bodies to soften, their breathing to slow, and their thoughts to gently release the weight of expectation, knowing that whatever remained ahead would arrive in its proper time. Moses rested among the people, no longer carrying the burden of urgency, content to let guidance unfold as it always had, step by step, moment by moment, trusting that what was unfinished did not mean incomplete, but simply still becoming. The night held them quietly, stars steady above, the desert calm around them. And in that peaceful enclosure, striving faded, questions grew quiet, and the journey found its true ending not in a place, but in rest. And so, with hearts untroubled and minds at ease, the people surrendered themselves to sleep, confident that even in rest, they were watched over, guided, and gently carried forward, allowing the stillness to deepen, the breath to slow, and sleep to come, soft and complete,